Now, it feels like I can't even tell you about how unexpected that ending made me feel in terms of an emotional sense. So if you've seen the 2005 Brangelina version, expect to see something quite a bit better than that with this, starring Donald Glover as John Smith and Maya Erskine as Jane Smith. This show took me by surprise. It was beautifully shot, gorgeous to look at, had some strong performances, a star-studded cast, a perfect episode 6, and a finale that just rounded off the series in a great way. So with that, I thought I'd break down the show, explain the ending, and share my thoughts. Here is Mr. and Mrs. Smith ending explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The ending. Let's get into the question that's on everybody's mind. Did John and Jane Smith survive? Well, it's a tough one, isn't it? I'm going to refer to Maya's Jane as Jane 1, just so this doesn't cause confusion, as there were 2 Janes in the conclusion. We know that Jane 1 only had 1 bullet left in her weapon, and the other Jane, Jane 2, on the outside of the door had plenty more. With Jane 1 saying that she was going to open the door and fire at Jane 2, the camera showed us a shot of outside of the property, and from inside there were 3 flashes that went off, most likely symbolizing that there were 3 bullets that were fired. You could argue that one of the flashes was from Jane 1 as she opened the door, another from Jane 2 outside, and then one more to finish the person off who was hit. That means that either Jane 1 fired at her, there was then a shot fired back by Jane 2, and then maybe Jane 1 walked over and finished her off with her own weapon. Or Jane 1 could have fired her weapon and then in response Jane 2 could have pulled the trigger twice, killing them both. However, on the other side of the argument, you could argue that Jane 2 has been an agent for around 15 years and was a super high risk agent, so she would have had a lot more experience in those types of situations, especially considering that her and John 2 were only tasked with killing other Smiths. So the ending's genuinely something that's left open for interpretation. Honestly, I like to think that they both got hit and the cycle ended there, meaning that none of them ended up surviving. Almost like a poetic way for them to all go out. Jane 1 always wanted to progress higher up and increase her risk level, so by killing Jane 2 that would have meant that she did actually finally do it. The fact it could be a poetic ending is also fitting considering the focus that the book The Prophet got, but that's something I'll touch on in a couple of minutes. All throughout the finale we knew what was coming with both John and Jane having to eventually face off against one another. And the Truth Serum was a nice touch where we saw the both of them finally being honest with one another for the first time in the entirety of their relationship. We saw that Jane did truly love John and wanted to be with him, but she had sociopathic tendencies which lied within her which she kept secret. Hearing how John said that he wanted children more than anything in the world was something which leaned into the type of person that he was. The fact that he wanted to pay his father and his grandmother back by having a child, a way of continuing the family line, family name, and providing and caring for a new life showed just how much it meant to him, showing that he didn't want to leave his old life behind and cut off the family name. Both John and Jane were deliberately missing each other during the climax because of the care that they had for one another. It was something that they'd never felt before or experienced with anybody else. During the ending, inside of the panic room, we heard Jane's real name, which was Alana. This was after us finding out that John's name was Michael from his mother earlier on in the episode. This was Jane fully opening up to him. John had been half in and half out with leaving his former life behind, but the love that he had for his mother was something which nothing and nobody was going to be able to stop him from feeling. Hence why he continued to speak with her, even though cutting ties with your former life was one of the first questions that Hi asked in order to become a Smith. Jane revealing her real name and John saying that he preferred Jane, and her then responding by saying that she preferred John showed that they were accepting each other for who they'd fallen in love with, rather than the people that wanted to leave their former lives behind. The shot of John holding his wound but still wearing his wedding ring on his hand as he was trying to keep the wound contained was one that really stuck with me, because it almost showed that he cared about her so much and did love her like he said he did, despite them being apart. John was slowly dying due to the wound that he had, and with a single tear going down his face, we saw Alana say that they could have one child together, as she had a tear too, knowing that this could well be the end for the both of them. She never wanted children, but her saying that she did in that moment showed that he was the one for her. I felt like this was a moment of reflection where they were both almost thinking that they just wished that they hadn't let the distance grow so strong between them, because their feelings were basically back to where they were before they needed couples therapy and their life started falling apart. It's similar to what we saw Garvel Martin and Parker go through in the early parts of the season. They had to be faced with death to truly understand what they meant to one another. It's an open-ended ending, and one that I think is all the better for it. With it ending the way that it did, it doesn't look like there'll be a season 2. At least, I hope there's not, because I think the ending will lose a lot of its weight if it does return. Maybe they could do a season 2 where they get different people to play a different version of John and Jane Smith. I think that would work, but I'm going to go with the idea that they all ended up dying. A more Shakespearean ending. Whilst we're on the topic of writers, the book The Prophet had a large importance in the show. The Prophet is a book which consists of poems which are about love, death, family, work, and freedom. Something which this very show is about, balancing all of them in the desire to find what truly makes one person happy. This was present throughout both of the characters in the show, and it's super relevant for that reason. The very last thing that we saw at the end of the show was Paul Dano's character dropping a book round to the property that he was interested in, and it seemed like he was the only person that got a happy ending. The house that he wanted to sell was readily available to be sold, and he felt he got his Moby Dick, the house that he was just purely obsessed with selling in order to make commission. But I guess that all depends on if John and Jane actually survived, which I don't know if they did, so maybe he didn't get a happy ending after all. Overall review. Personally, I thought this show was a really good ride. It didn't want to be anything more than that, and it didn't try to be either. It knew what it wanted to achieve, and it did exactly that. For a show that was mainly about spies, action, killing, and facing death on every mission, it actually provided some quite emotional moments. More specifically, most of episode 6 and also the ending of the finale when John and Jane were inside of the panic room and he was slowly dying. The emotion that was present on both of the characters' faces, you really felt the journey that they went on together and the discovering of who they truly were, and the almost regret that they had in treating each other in that way. For me, episode 6 was my favourite. I thought it was a beautifully crafted episode where we saw the deterioration of their marriage and relationship. What started as a colourful episode where they were sat next to each other on the sofa concluded with the both of them sitting on completely opposite sides, where a real grey tinge to the shots was applied in the edit. This episode was the beginning of the end, and it really came across the screen well. The entirety of the show looked really nice on the eye. It looked like it was filmed on film, but I don't think it was. However, the grainy look that was applied really suited the tone that it was going for. The grittiness and harsh reality of what they were doing felt like it was represented by that. It was kind of obvious that the other versions of John and Jane would come back into the picture at some point, but it didn't take anything else away from it or make the finale feel weak. One thing that I thought really stood out in the show was the partnership that both Donald Glover and Maya Erskine had together. Some of the best lines came from when they were just in bed together or on the sofa, laughing and joking, sharing intimate conversation, something that's present in all relationships. It felt genuine and like we were watching an actual relationship blossom between the both of them. Because of that, it made it so much easier to watch. I would say that this show is definitely worth a watch. It's got a great cast, some surprise star appearances, and a well-paced story that, although it does get a bit repetitive from about episode 3 to 5, it does have a good emotional payoff at the end. So if you're thinking about watching it and are on the fence, I'd say go over it, just like what John did to get to his property. It's well worth it. So, there you have it, Mr. and Mrs. Smith ending explained.